The scariest moments in NBA history are not always the ones that end a season. Sometimes they are the ones that make an arena forget the score completely. A player drops with no contact. A body lands the wrong way. A routine night suddenly turns into silence panic and medical staff sprinting onto the floor. And the most terrifying part is that in almost every case, it happens before anyone has time to understand what they are even looking at. There is something uniquely terrifying about a basketball scare that comes with no collision, no bad landing, and no obvious explanation. That is exactly why Bismack Biyombo's collapse in March 2024 hit so hard. During a timeout in the Thunder's game against Portland, he was simply standing near the sideline and then suddenly he went down. No contact, no warning, no buildup, just panic. In an arena, that kind of moment spreads fear instantly because nobody knows what they are seeing. A wheelchair was brought out. Teammates and staff rushed in. For a few seconds, it looked far worse than any normal in-game injury. Later, doctors confirmed it was dehydration connected to fasting, and thankfully nothing more serious showed up in testing. He was joking again by halftime, which helped calm the fear. But that did not erase the image. Because when a player's body suddenly gives out with no visible reason, the mind immediately goes to the darkest place possible. If Biyombo's collapse was terrifying because nobody understood it in the moment, Bronny James was even more frightening because people immediately understood how serious it could be. In July 2023, during a USC workout, Bronny suffered cardiac arrest. And the second those words entered the public conversation, basketball stopped mattering. This was no longer about a prospect, a famous last name, or a future NBA career. It was about survival. That is what makes this kind of moment so haunting. A player can look young, strong, healthy, and still be one medical emergency away from everything changing. Bronny was rushed to the hospital, treated in intensive care, and for a while the entire conversation around him shifted from potential to uncertainty. Later, his family confirmed the cause was a congenital heart defect that could be treated. He eventually returned to the court, which gave the story a hopeful turn. But the fear of that day never really disappeared because it reminded everyone how thin the line is between routine training and real catastrophe. What made moments like Biyombo and Bronny so frightening was the same basic truth: danger did not wait for contact. It did not need a hard foul, a bad fall, or even a live play. And that is exactly why Rodney Stuckey's collapse in 2010 felt so unsettling. He was not attacking the rim. He was not crashing into traffic. He was sitting on the bench during a timeout when his body suddenly gave way. At first, it looked like the kind of thing people try to explain away in real time. Maybe dizziness, maybe fatigue, maybe nothing serious. But then the stretcher came out, oxygen was administered, and the entire arena shifted into that same awful silence that happens when nobody knows whether they are witnessing a scare or something far worse. The game stopped for more than 10 minutes. Later, the tests were reassuring, and Stuckey eventually returned. But that was never really the point. The point was this: if a player could collapse while doing nothing at all, then nowhere in the building really felt safe. The first three stories were frightening because the danger felt invisible. A body simply stopped responding the way it should, and nobody in the building knew why. But Marquis Daniels represented a different kind of terror. This time the fear was not hidden inside the body. It was right there on the floor for everyone to see. In December 2010, Daniels got tangled up in a routine-looking post play, and in an instant his neck bent awkwardly as he crashed down. He did not get up. He did not move. And that is the exact moment when a normal injury scare becomes something darker, because once the neck is involved, every second feels loaded with worst-case possibilities. Trainers rushed in, stabilized him, and placed him on a stretcher while the arena fell silent. Later, it was diagnosed as a bruised spinal cord rather than paralysis, which was the best news anyone could have hoped for. But the image stayed with people because basketball injuries are one thing. A spinal scare is something else entirely. Up to that point, the fear in these stories came from uncertainty. People were terrified because they did not know what had gone wrong. But Gordon Hayward's injury in the 2017 season opener was horrifying for the opposite reason. Everyone knew instantly. Hayward went up for an alley-oop, collided in the air, and landed in a way no athlete ever should. The reaction was immediate. Players turned away. Coaches froze. Fans fell silent. Even before the replay cycle could begin, the building understood that this was not a minor ankle sprain or a normal fall. It was one of those moments where the human body suddenly looks fragile in a sport that usually celebrates strength and control. Hayward suffered a dislocated ankle and a fractured tibia, and the scene was so disturbing that the game itself felt secondary from that point on. He would eventually fight his way back, but that night left a permanent mark because it showed how one single landing could alter an entire season, a career arc, and the emotional temperature of a whole arena. Some terrifying NBA moments happen in front of thousands of people. Everyone sees the fall, the collision, the body on the floor. But Chris Bosh's story was frightening in a completely different way because the danger was almost invisible until it was suddenly life-altering. In 2015, during All-Star Weekend, Bosh was hospitalized after experiencing pain and breathing issues. What followed was not a routine medical update. It was the discovery of blood clots in his lungs, a condition serious enough to threaten not just his season, but his life. That is what made this story so chilling. A player could look fine from the outside, still move like an elite star, and yet be carrying something inside his body that made playing basketball genuinely dangerous. Bosh wanted to return. He kept fighting for that possibility. But when the clot issue resurfaced, the conversation changed forever. This was no longer about toughness or rehab. It was about whether the game itself had become too dangerous to keep chasing. Chris Bosh's story showed that some of the most dangerous threats in basketball are the ones nobody can see. Nate Robinson's story pushed that fear even further because in his case, the danger did not explode in one night. It kept building quietly for years. Long after his NBA career had slowed down, Robinson was living with kidney failure severe enough to force him into regular dialysis just to stay alive. That is what makes his story so unsettling. There was no one shocking replay, no arena gasping at a fall, no single impact frozen on camera. Instead, it was a slower kind of terror, the kind that drains a person piece by piece. Robinson later spoke openly about vomiting, blacking out, losing strength, and realizing that without a transplant, time was no longer on his side. Eventually, he got that transplant, and the story finally turned toward hope. But the terrifying part remained the same. Some basketball battles do not end when the lights go out. Some follow you home and keep getting worse. Nate Robinson's story was terrifying because the damage built slowly, almost invisibly over time. Boban Jankovic was the opposite. In his case, everything changed in one violent burst. During a playoff game in Greece in 1993, Jankovic fouled out and erupted in frustration. What came next lasted only a second, but it carried consequences for the rest of his life. He slammed himself into the base behind the backboard and suffered a devastating spinal injury. That is what makes this one of the darkest basketball stories ever told. It was not a collision with another player. It was not a freak landing during a rebound. It was one flash of emotion that turned into irreversible tragedy. Jankovic was left paralyzed, and from that point on, the story stopped being about a game entirely. It became about how unbelievably thin the line can be between heat-of-the-moment rage and permanent loss. And maybe that is what makes it so haunting. Sometimes the most terrifying moment is the one nobody thinks will happen until it already has. By the time you get to a story like Boban Jankovic, the fear in basketball no longer feels limited to one category. Sometimes it is the heart, sometimes it is the spine, sometimes it is a hidden illness, and sometimes it is one landing that tells a player instantly that something has gone terribly wrong. That is why Jeremy Lin's injury in the 2017 season opener hit so hard. He drove to the rim, came down awkwardly, and the moment he landed, you could see it in his face. Before the official diagnosis, before the scans, before the full medical report, Lin already seemed to understand the truth. He sat on the floor and said, "I'm done." That line made the moment heavier than a normal knee injury. It sounded like a player feeling an entire season disappear in real time. The diagnosis was a ruptured patellar tendon, and his year was over almost before it began. That is what makes it terrifying. Sometimes the body breaks, and sometimes the mind knows it first. Jeremy Lin's moment was terrifying because you could see the realization hit him before the diagnosis ever arrived. Chris Dunn was different. There was no time for realization first. It went from clean highlight to violent disaster in one motion. During a Bulls game against Golden State, Dunn picked off a pass, took off in transition, and finished what looked like a routine fast break dunk. Then everything flipped. As he held the rim for a split second, he lost control, pitched forward, and crashed face first into the hardwood. The sound alone made it feel worse. Blood came immediately. His front teeth were chipped and knocked out of place. Trainers rushed in, and the scene stopped feeling like basketball at all. That is what made it so unsettling. There was no dirty play, no fight, no reckless hit. just timing gravity and one small mistake that turned a breakaway into one of the ugliest visuals of that season. Sometimes terror in the NBA does not come from contact. Sometimes it comes from how fast the body can lose control. That is what makes the most terrifying moments in NBA history so unforgettable. They remind us that beneath the highlights, the noise, and the fame, the game can turn frightening in a single second.